He thought no one was watching. A maintenance worker, MOP bucket, worn boots, a name badge nobody bothered to read, sitting beside a blind 8-year-old girl at a concert grand piano on the 42nd floor of one of the most powerful corporate towers in the country. His hands, scarred from things he never talked about, moved across the keys like he'd been born to them. The little girl laughed, really laughed, the kind that fills a room and doesn't ask permission. Neither of them heard the door open behind them. Neither of them saw the woman standing in the shadow of the doorway, the woman who owned the building, owned the floor, owned the piano, watching with an expression that no one in the business world had ever seen on her face before. This is the story of what happened next, and I promise you, you won't see it coming. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe kindness still matters, and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one starts 3 years before that rainy night, and you need to know who Damon Cross really was before you can understand why that piano duet changed everything. The building had a way of making people feel small. Aurelius Global's headquarters rose 47 floors above the financial district, all dark glass and polished granite, the kind of architecture that didn't whisper money so much as announce it without apology. At street level, black SUVs idled in a permanent rotation. Security personnel stood at every entrance in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The lobby alone, with its floating marble staircase and 12-foot digital installation cycling through quarterly earnings data, felt less like a place of business and more like a monument to the idea that some people had simply won at the game everyone else was still playing. Damon Cross entered through the service entrance on Kellner Street, the same way he had every night for 14 months. He didn't use the main doors. He'd never been invited to. His access badge was color-coded gray, maintenance tier, restricted to service corridors, utility rooms, and the cleaning schedule printed on a laminated card he kept in his shirt pocket. He clocked in at 9:47 p.m., the same time he always did, pulled his cart from the supply closet near the loading dock, and started his rounds on the lower floors. Nobody really looked at Damon. That wasn't bitterness. It was just a fact he'd made his peace with. In a building full of directors and vice presidents and junior associates who walked fast and talked into earpieces, a man pushing a mop cart was about as visible as a fire extinguisher on the wall. Useful if something went wrong. Otherwise, part of the background. He was 32 years old, though most people who bothered to guess figured him for older. There were lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with experience, and he carried himself with a stillness that sometimes made newer employees uncomfortable without them being able to say why. He was medium height, broad through the shoulders, with hands that seemed slightly too large for the rest of him, thick-knuckled, marked with a pale scar that ran diagonally across his right palm from the base of his index finger to his wrist. He never explained the scar. He didn't explain much about himself at all, which some of the other night shift workers took as arrogance and others took as sadness. The truth was simpler and more complicated than either. Damon Cross had spent 6 years as a Navy SEAL, 2 of them in a specialized rescue and recovery unit that operated in places the official record described only as classified theater. He had pulled 19 people out of situations they weren't supposed to survive. He had buried 2 teammates whose names he kept written in the inside cover of a notebook he never showed anyone. And then, 31 months ago, he had walked out of a debrief in a government building in Virginia, driven 4 hours to his mother-in-law's house in western Pennsylvania, picked up his 5-year-old son from the kitchen table where the boy was eating cereal and watching cartoons, and never gone back. His son's name was Marcus. He was 8 now, small for his age, with his mother's eyes and a habit of humming to himself when he was concentrating that Damon couldn't listen to without his chest doing something uncomfortable. Marcus's mother, Damon's wife, Claire, had been dead for 2 years and 4 months. Damon had not told anyone at Aurelius Global this. He hadn't told them about the military career either, or the commendations, or the 6 weeks he'd spent in a veterans counseling program in Maryland before deciding that talking about it wasn't making the weight any lighter, and he should just find a way to carry it differently. What they knew from his application was that he had some general facilities maintenance experience, that he was punctual, that his references checked out, and that he was available for overnight shifts, which was a scheduling gap most applicants didn't want to fill. He got the job in 10 minutes. His supervisor, a man named Gerald Huang, who ran the night maintenance division with the weary efficiency of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything, had shaken his hand and said, "You start Monday. Don't be late. Don't use the executive elevators, and don't bother the tenants." Damon had followed all three instructions without difficulty. The tenants were rarely present after 9 at night, and those who were tended to be the kind of driven, self-contained people who generated their own atmosphere and didn't require acknowledgement from the maintenance staff. He cleaned their offices, emptied their waste bins, and moved on. It was honest work. It paid enough to cover rent on the 2-bedroom apartment in Grover Heights where he and Marcus lived, with a little left over. Marcus went to school. Damon slept until 2 in the afternoon, picked Marcus up at 3:30, made dinner, helped with homework, and got him to bed before heading back to the building. It was not the life he had imagined for himself at 22, shipping out for the first time with the particular combination of terror and pride that belongs exclusively to young men who've just signed their names to something enormous. But it was a life, and it was his, and most nights he managed to be quietly grateful for it. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in October. Rain had been hammering the city since late afternoon, the kind of autumn downpour that turned the streets into dark mirrors and drove even the most dedicated late workers toward their cars before 10. The building was emptier than usual. Damon had breezed through the lower floors faster than expected and was riding the service elevator to 42 ahead of schedule, cart loaded with fresh supplies, earbuds in, listening to nothing. He'd given up on podcasts. They made him feel like he was supposed to be somewhere else. When the elevator doors opened and he heard it. Piano. He stood in the elevator doorway for a moment, one hand holding the door sensor, and just listened. It wasn't background music from someone's office system. It wasn't a recording. It was live. Slightly unsteady in places, with a hesitation in the left hand that suggested the player was working something out rather than performing it. And it was coming from the east end of the floor, from behind the double doors that led to the Aurelius Concert Hall. The concert hall was one of those features that said everything you needed to know about what kind of company Aurelius Global considered itself to be. It seated 200, had acoustics designed by a firm out of Vienna, and housed a 9-foot Steinway concert grand that Damon had been told, by a fellow maintenance worker named Priya, who knew things, had cost more than most houses. The hall was used for quarterly investor presentations, the occasional charity gala, and a series of cultural programming events that Vivian Ashcroft, the company's CEO, apparently considered important to the building's identity. It was cleaned on Monday and Thursday nights, and this was Tuesday, which meant Damon had no scheduled reason to be in there. He pulled out his cart, let the elevator doors close, and stood in the corridor listening. The melody was something he half recognized, not classical exactly, more the kind of piece that sat in the space between classical structure and something more instinctive, built from a simple 5-note motif that kept climbing and then pulling back like it was reaching for something it couldn't quite touch. Whoever was playing it had good instincts. The trouble was, the left hand kept losing the thread in the lower register, landing a half beat behind in a way that broke the emotional momentum every time it happened. He shouldn't have cared about that. He pushed his cart down the corridor, stopped outside the concert hall doors, and stood there longer than he should have. The smart thing was to move on, finish his rounds, keep his head down. Gerald had said, "Don't bother the tenants." A child playing piano in the building's concert hall after 10 at night was not his concern. And getting involved in anything related to the executive floor was exactly the kind of thing a man in his position had no business doing. He pushed the door open anyway. The hall was mostly dark, lit only by the small lamp above the piano's music stand and the ambient glow of the city coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows along the west wall. The rain was visible against the glass in long silver streaks. The Steinway sat on the raised platform at the far end, its lid fully open, and at the bench sat a small girl in a dark blue dress, her feet not quite reaching the pedals, her posture straight and careful in the way of someone who had been taught to sit correctly and was working hard to remember it. She had dark hair pulled back with a clip that had a small white flower on it. Her eyes were open, aimed at the middle distance above the keys, and it took Damon about 3 seconds to understand that she wasn't looking at anything. She was tracking sound. Her head moved slightly with each phrase, the tiny adjustments of someone navigating the world without the shortcut that most people didn't even know they were using. Damon stopped just inside the door, holding the handle. The girl played the phrase again. Got to the same spot in the left hand. Stopped. Her jaw tightened. She pressed the three-note bass figure again, slowly, separately, trying to lock it in. Then she tried the full phrase and it slipped again, just slightly, the timing gone soft at the seam. I keep losing it, she said, to the empty room. Damon was quiet for a moment. You're dropping the third note. The girl didn't startle, which surprised him. She turned her head in his direction with a composure that seemed practiced, the composure of someone who had learned not to be frightened by voices in rooms she couldn't see clearly. I know, she said. My finger keeps sliding off. Which finger? She held up her left hand without looking at it. Ring finger. It's a stretch, Damon said, that interval, especially at tempo. Do you play? He should have said no. He should have said he was just maintenance and let her get back to it and moved on down the corridor to clean the executive bathrooms like he was scheduled to do. Used to, he said. She turned back to the keys. My name is Emma. I'm not supposed to be in here past 9 o'clock. Mine's Damon. He stayed where he was, near the door. Neither are you supposed to be in here by yourself. I'm not by myself anymore, she said, with a logic so clean it almost made him smile. My tutors leave at 8:30. I wait until the security guard on this floor goes for his walk. She paused. He goes at 10:15. He's gone for 11 minutes, and there's a corner in the corridor with a blind spot. I figured it out. Damon looked at her for a moment. How old are you? 8. She played the three-note bass figure again. Almost 9. How old are you? 32. That's not old, she said, as if she'd been asked to evaluate it. My mom's 30. She seems older, though. He came a little farther into the room, not all the way to the piano, just enough that he wasn't hovering in the doorway. The rain on the windows was the only other sound. Play the left-hand part again, he said. Just the left, slow. She did. He watched her fingers. The ring finger was collapsing inward at the tip instead of staying curved, losing contact with the key surface at the moment of transfer. Basic technique issue, the kind that a good teacher would catch in the first lesson and a mediocre one would let slide for months. You're collapsing the fingertip, he said. Curve it more, like you're holding something small in your palm. She adjusted, played the 3 notes. Better. Now again. She played it 6 times, slowly, each time a little more secure. Now add the right hand. Psalm tempo. She did. And it held. She stopped and turned toward him with an expression he recognized. Not quite disbelief, more the look of someone recalibrating, like a small recalibration of what was possible. It worked, she said. Technique usually does, he said. She turned back to the piano and played the full phrase from the beginning, and this time it moved the way it was supposed to. The right hand carrying the melody up through that yearning climb, the left holding the ground steady underneath it, the whole thing breathing like one thing instead of 2 separate parts fighting for position. She played it through twice without stopping. Then she said, without looking up, Do you know what comes after? After what? After the part I just played. The melody goes up, and then I don't know what it wants to do. He was quiet. He did know. He knew exactly where a melody like that wanted to go. He'd spent 3 years in his early 20s studying music theory at a community college before the Navy, back when he'd had a different idea about what his life was going to look like, back when he'd thought he'd maybe teach someday, or compose, or do something with the thing that happened inside him when he sat down at a piano. He hadn't touched one since Claire died. He wasn't entirely sure why, except that it felt like a room in his chest he didn't have the right to enter anymore. He walked to the piano. He sat down on the bench, leaving space, not crowding her, and for a moment he just looked at the keys, the specific white and black geometry of them under the lamp, the way a piano was the same instrument everywhere you went, regardless of everything else. He put his right hand on the keys an octave above where Emma had left off. He played the resolution. 5 notes, a simple descending answer to the climbing question in her phrase, the kind of melodic call and response that had been built into music for as long as people had been making it. He played it once, without flourish, just the notes themselves. Emma listened with her whole body. Again, she said quietly. He played it again. She found her place in the left hand, and before he could say anything else, she started playing her part. And he stayed with his, and for 4 or 5 minutes, he genuinely lost track of the time, which was unusual for him. He was a man who kept meticulous track of time. The two of them played together in the dark hall, the rain against the windows, the city glowing below, neither of them talking, just following where the music went. When they stopped, naturally, at a place where the piece seemed to arrive somewhere, Emma sat for a moment with her hands still on the keys. "You're not really just a maintenance person," she said. "That's exactly what I am," Damon said. "Maintenance people don't play like that." "You'd be surprised," he said, and meant it. He'd served alongside men who could do things that would astonish most people who sorted the world into categories and assumed they knew what each category contained. Emma reached out and touched the edge of the key cover, orienting herself the way he'd noticed she did with objects, getting her bearings. "Will you come back tomorrow night?" she asked. Her voice stayed even, no particular urgency in it, but something underneath it that he recognized. Not desperation, just hope that had learned to be careful about how much space it took up. Damon stood from the bench. "You shouldn't be sneaking up here." "I know," she said. "I do it anyway." He picked up the bench's end cap, straightening it, old habit, everything in its proper place, and walked back toward his cart by the door. "I've got floors to clean," he said. "Is that a yes or a no?" He pulled the door open. "Get home before 11:15. The guard comes back." "You counted too," she said, and there was something satisfied in her voice. He went back into the corridor and stood for a moment with his hand on the door, letting it close. Through the gap he could still hear her. She was playing the phrase again, both hands this time, and it was holding, clean and steady and confident in a way it hadn't been 20 minutes ago. He pushed his cart down the hall and started on the executive bathrooms. He told himself he wouldn't go back. He told himself this with the same reasonable certainty he'd used to make other decisions he didn't ultimately keep. And somewhere under the reasonable certainty was the knowledge that Emma's question, "Will you come back tomorrow night?" had landed somewhere in him that he hadn't expected anything to land in for a long time. He thought about Marcus, who was asleep in Grover Heights right now under his blue comforter, who had started asking recently whether Damon was happy, not in those words. Marcus was 8. He said things like, "You seem quiet, Dad," quieter than usual. And Damon never quite knew how to answer that in a way that was honest without being heavy. He thought about the piano in the hall and Emma's left hand finding the interval, and the way the room had felt when the two parts of the music were finally moving together. He cleaned 3 more floors before his shift ended. He clocked out at 5:52 a.m., took the service elevator down, walked out into a morning that had stopped raining while he wasn't paying attention, and drove home through streets that were wet and very quiet. He did not think about the security cameras. Nobody ever did in moments like that. The cameras were always there, watching everything, recording everything, cataloging moments that the people inside them were too absorbed in living to notice. Somewhere on a server in the building's security infrastructure, a 16-minute clip of a maintenance worker and a blind 8-year-old girl playing piano together in an empty concert hall was already saved, time-stamped, and waiting. Damon parked in front of his building, sat in the car for a minute with the engine off, and looked at his right hand on the steering wheel. The scar across his palm, the thickness of the knuckles. Hands that had done a lot of things in 32 years, some of them he was proud of, some he wasn't, and now apparently this, the memory of ivory keys under his fingertips and a little girl's face turning toward him in the dark with something that looked very much like relief. He went inside. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table until Marcus's alarm went off in the next room, and then he got up to make breakfast, and the morning started the way mornings did. The ordinary machinery of a life that was small and real and his. He told himself he wouldn't go back. He said this out loud, actually, standing in his kitchen the next morning while Marcus ate toast and watched a nature documentary about migratory birds on his tablet, the volume low enough that it was more texture than sound. Damon said it under his breath while rinsing his coffee cup, like a small private contract with himself. He had a schedule. He had floors to clean and bathrooms to restock, and a supervisor who expected him to stay in his lane. He was not a music teacher. He was not a therapist or a mentor or any of the other things that a man in his situation had absolutely no business becoming, especially not to the blind daughter of the woman who essentially owned the building he mopped floors in. Marcus looked up from his tablet. "What?" "Nothing," Damon said. "Talking to myself." "You do that a lot lately," Marcus said, with the particular calm of an 8-year-old who has decided to be honest about things. I know, Damon said. Eat your toast. Marcus ate his toast. The birds on the screen flew in formation over a gray ocean. Damon dried his hands on a dish towel and looked out the kitchen window at the parking lot below, where a man was scraping the overnight frost off his windshield with what appeared to be a library card. He went back that night, and the night after that. It wasn't a decision so much as a failure to make the opposite one, which was a distinction that mattered to Damon more than it would have to most people. He didn't persuade himself it was the right thing. He just went back. Emma was already at the piano when he arrived on the second night, a Wednesday, sitting in the same dark hall with the city glowing through the rain-streaked windows. She'd changed the clip in her hair, a red one this time, and she was playing the same section they'd worked on, but slower, more deliberately, with the concentrated precision of someone running a diagnostic. She heard him come in before he said anything. You counted my steps yesterday, she said, not turning around. 14 from the door to the bench. 13, he said. You're counting from when the door opened. I was already moving. She considered this. 13, she agreed. I'll remember that. He sat down beside her and they picked up where they'd left off. And it was different from the first night in a way that was hard to articulate. Less tentative, the two of them settling into a working rhythm without having to negotiate it. Emma had clearly been practicing the passage they'd fixed. The left hand was secure now, the ring finger staying curved and firm through the interval, and she'd extended the piece by another 8 bars on her own, feeling out where it wanted to go. I wrote this part myself, she said when he didn't comment immediately. I know, he said. I can tell. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Depends on why you did it. She played the new section again. I heard the rest of it in my head when I was trying to fall asleep. I didn't want to lose it. Damon listened. The new bars had a slight roughness to them. The harmonic choices were intuitive but not always technically clean. And yet there was something in them that the earlier section, which was clearly more studied, didn't quite have. A particular quality of motion, the sense of a phrase discovering itself as it went. Don't over-polish it, he said. She stopped. What? That roughness in the middle, the chord you're not sure about. Don't fix it yet. Play it 100 more times first and see if it still bothers you. Sometimes what feels like a mistake is the only honest thing in the room. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she played the rough chord deliberately, holding it, listening to how it sat in the hall's acoustics. My tutor would say it's wrong, she said. Your tutor's probably right by the book, Damon said. Play it again. She did. You hear how it pulls, he said. That's tension. That's the piece telling you it hasn't finished saying something yet. You can't get resolution if you don't have tension first. She played it a third time, and something shifted in her face, not quite understanding yet, more the precursor to it, the moment before a thing clicks into place. What Damon didn't say out loud was that he'd forgotten this. He'd genuinely forgotten the specific quality of sitting next to someone while they were learning, not teaching in the formal sense, not running a lesson with a structured objective, but just being in the room while another person's understanding opened up a little more. It had a particular texture. He hadn't felt it in years. By the fourth night, they had a routine. Emma arrived at the hall by 9:45, which was when the security guard on 42, a man named Collins, whom Damon had established a careful, nods-only professional relationship with, took his first walk of the shift. Damon would arrive shortly after, having finished the lower floors, and they'd work until roughly 11 o'clock, at which point he'd send her back toward the private elevator with a reminder about Collins's return schedule that she never needed because she'd already memorized it. She was like that with systems. She absorbed patterns the way most people absorbed surfaces, through repeated contact, processing the information into something she could navigate by. She'd had to learn this, Damon understood, because the world didn't build its systems with her in mind, and she'd had to develop her own map of everything around her, constructed entirely from the information that wasn't visual. He started paying attention to how she moved through space and adjusted how he communicated accordingly without consciously deciding to. He stopped gesturing when he wanted to indicate something on the keys and used positions instead. Third white key from the left, 2 down from the octave mark. He described things in terms of how they felt rather than how they looked. He noticed that she tracked audio with a precision that was almost uncomfortable to observe, The way she'd tilt her head a few degrees and reconstruct an entire room from sound bouncing off walls. "You mapped this hall," he said one evening, about a week in. It wasn't quite a question. "The first time I came," she said, "I walked the perimeter with my hand on the seats. It took 12 minutes. She played a chord, held it. "It's 68 feet from the door to the stage. The piano is 9.2 feet from the front edge." "How do you know 9.2? "I stepped it out. My stride is approximately 18 inches. Damon thought about this. "You ever miscalculate?" "Constantly," she said, without any particular distress. "I just recalibrate." He taught her things. Not in a lesson plan way. He didn't have a lesson plan, didn't have any framework for what he was doing beyond the music itself and what it seemed to need on any given night. He talked about dynamics not as volume, but as emotional weather, the difference between a passage that was soft because it was distant and one that was soft because it was close. He showed her how to use the sustain pedal not as a blur switch, but as a breathing tool, the way a singer controls air. He also, without planning to, talked about other things. The talking happened gradually, in the way that conversation tends to happen when two people are focused on a shared task, and the talking is really just the loose thread around the edges of the work. Emma asked questions the way she played piano, directly, without preamble, getting to the point before most people had finished considering whether to approach it. "Do you have kids?" she asked, on maybe the 5th or 6th night. "A son, Marcus. He's 8, same as you." "What's he like?" Damon thought about how to answer this honestly. "Serious," he said. "Funnier than he lets on. He worries about things he doesn't tell me about, and then acts like he's fine." "He sounds like me," Emma said. "A little," Damon admitted. "Does he know you play piano?" Damon set his hands on his knees away from the keys. "No." Emma processed this. She wasn't the kind of person who felt the need to fill silence with follow-up just because she'd received an incomplete answer. She let it sit there, and Damon appreciated that about her more than he could have explained. "My mom doesn't know I come here," Emma said. "I know." "She's very busy." This wasn't said with bitterness, which made it worse somehow. Just a flat statement of fact, the kind that children produce when they've had enough time with the truth to stop fighting it. "She has meetings until 11 most nights, sometimes later. Her assistant sends me goodnight texts on her behalf." Damon didn't say anything. "She loves me," Emma said, still without bitterness. "She just doesn't always know what to do with me. I think I make her nervous." "Why?" Emma tilted her head slightly, that habit of hers when she was organizing her thoughts. "Because she can fix most things. She's very good at fixing things. And she can't fix me." A pause. "I don't think I need fixing, but she hasn't figured that out yet." It was the most precise diagnosis of a parent-child dynamic that Damon had heard from an 8-year-old, and it landed with a specificity that made him quiet for a minute. "My son thinks I need fixing too," he said. "He just doesn't know the word for it." "Do you?" "Need fixing?" "Yes." He considered it with the same seriousness she'd offered the question. "Probably," he said. "Parts of me." Emma nodded once, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected, and went back to playing. Meanwhile, Damon's days had started to shift in small ways he didn't entirely recognize until they'd already shifted. He found himself stopping at a music supply store on Hargrove Avenue during the week, not to buy anything, just to stand in the sheet music section for 10 minutes, flipping through contemporary piano collections with the focused attention of someone looking for something specific. He bought a book of intermediate exercises and left it on the kitchen counter, and Marcus, who noticed everything, picked it up one afternoon and said, "Is this yours?" "Research," Damon said. Marcus set it down carefully, in exactly the same spot, which meant he was deliberately not making a thing of it. He was good at that. Damon also started sleeping better, which surprised him. Not a lot better. He still woke at 3-something most mornings, that particular hour that belonged to the thoughts you couldn't get to surrender. But the quality of the sleep before 3 was different, less like bracing for impact. He didn't examine this too closely. At the building, his relationship with the 42nd floor had developed a specific texture. He knew which tiles near the concert hall doors tended to squeak and how to route his cart around them. He knew that Collins, the security guard, was punctual to within 2 minutes, and that the man had a coffee routine at 10:15 that never varied. He knew that the ambient sound in the east corridor changed when the HVAC cycled down for its overnight reduction, dropping from a low hum to almost nothing, and that this happened at 10:30 and gave Emma about 8 seconds of warning before she needed to finish any passage she was in the middle of. The other maintenance workers on the night shift, there were 4 of them, covering different zones, noticed something different about Damon without being able to name it. Priya, who cleaned floors 30 through 35 and had a habit of eating her lunch at the same table as Damon in the break room, said one night, "You seem less, I don't know, less sealed up." "I'm the same," Damon said. "You're not, but okay." She opened her thermos. "You meet someone?" "No." "Get a dog?" "No." "Huh." She poured her soup. "Well, something." He didn't respond. She didn't push. It was one of the things he liked about Priya. She had good instincts about when a door was open and when it was just ajar, and she respected the difference. What he couldn't have told her, even if he'd wanted to, was that the something was simple and strange and almost embarrassing in how small it was. He was looking forward to something again. Not in a dramatic way, not in any way that he could have pointed to and called meaningful, but there it was, a real, functional, honest anticipation about what was going to happen at 9:45 on the 42nd floor, about what section Emma would have pushed forward on her own since the previous night, about what problem she'd present and what the solution would turn out to be. It was small, but it was there, and it was real, and it was more than he'd had for a while. Emma was changing too, in ways he could track through the music. In the first week, she played with a carefulness that was almost defensive, each note tested before committed to, the interpretive choices minimal, a kind of musical hedging that said, "I'm not sure what I'm allowed to do here." By the second week, she was taking more risks, holding notes longer than strictly necessary, adding small ornaments, a grace note here, a slight rubato there, that weren't in any version of the piece she'd been taught, but felt right to her. When Damon didn't correct these, she did them again the next night with a little more confidence, and then again until they became part of how she played. "My tutor says I rush," she told him one evening. "You do rush," he said, "but not out of sloppiness. You rush because you're impatient to get to the part you want to say." She thought about this. "Is that different?" "Yeah, sloppiness is not caring. Impatience is caring too much. One of those you can work with." She played the passage again, this time holding back the tempo in the first half, letting it breathe, so that when the section she was actually excited about arrived, it had the space to land properly. "Like that?" she asked. "Exactly like that." She allowed herself a small, private smile that she probably didn't know was visible. There were also nights where it didn't work, where the music wasn't the point, and the music knew it. An evening in the second week where Emma came in tighter than usual, the way a person looks when they've been holding something together all day, and the muscles are starting to tire. She sat at the piano and played for 10 minutes without them saying anything to each other, and then she stopped and said, "The school called my mom today. They want to put me in a different class, a slower one." "What do you think about that?" "I think it's insulting," she said, with a controlled precision that suggested she'd been sitting on the word for hours. "Because the class would be easier? Because they think blindness means slower." Her jaw was set. "I'm not slow. I'm 8 and I can play Chopin, and I learned Mandarin last year, and I know the entire layout of our building from memory, including every fire exit and the weight capacity of the service elevator." Damon was quiet for a moment. "Did you tell your mom that?" "She was on a call." A beat. "She usually is." He didn't push on that. Instead he said, "Play me the Chopin." She turned to him, uncertain whether he was serious. He kept his expression even. She turned back to the keys and played the opening of a nocturne. Slow, measured, technically careful. And it was good. Genuinely good. Not perfect. Her tempo had the slight inconsistency of someone self-taught in places, and one of the ornaments landed a fraction crooked. But the shape of it was real. The understanding was there. When she finished, Damon said, "You're not slow." She didn't say thank you. She just sat up a little straighter, and they got back to work. He thought about her on his drive home that night. He thought about Marcus, who had said that week, unprompted, that he wanted to learn guitar, and Damon had said, "We'll see," which was a parent's way of buying time when he didn't know how to say yes yet. He thought about the school that wanted to move Emma to a slower class and the mother who was on a call. He thought about how many kids were sitting somewhere in rooms that had underestimated them so thoroughly that they'd started to do it to themselves. He didn't solve anything on the drive home. He rarely did. But he kept thinking about it, the way you turn a stone over in your pocket. Not because you expect it to change, just because it's there and the weight of it is telling you something. The 17th night was a Thursday, almost 3 weeks into something that still didn't have a name between them and probably didn't need one. Emma had been working on the final movement of the piece she'd been composing since before Damon came into the picture. A piece she hadn't titled, hadn't described to him in any formal terms, just worked on the way you work on something that matters enough to keep returning to without needing it to be finished. They'd been at it for almost an hour when she played a new section for the first time, something she'd clearly worked out in her room, alone, because its construction had that particular quality of private thought-made sound. It started low, almost restrained, and then it opened in a way that pushed up into the hall's acoustics and seemed to fill all of the space at once, and Damon sat beside her and didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. "Too much?" she asked. She asked this in the voice of someone who knew. It wasn't too much, but who had learned to offer the question anyway, to leave room for the answer to be different from the one they were hoping for. "No," he said. No. Where did that come from? She thought about it genuinely. It just wanted to be that way. Then let it be that way. She played it again, and he sat and listened, and the hall held the sound the way a hall like that was designed to, not dampening it, but letting it live, letting each note complete itself fully before the next one arrived. Neither of them was thinking about the cameras. The cameras were always there, small and unobtrusive, mounted in the upper corners of every room on every floor, part of the building's security infrastructure that ran around the clock and archived everything to a server in the basement. Damon knew they existed. He'd cleaned around the hardware a dozen times. But you don't think about the camera when you're in the middle of something. You think about the thing you're in the middle of. What Damon didn't know, what neither of them could have known in that moment, was that 3 floors above them, in an office that nobody else entered without a calendar appointment, Vivian Ashcroft had been working until past midnight every night that week, and that her head of corporate security, a careful, thorough man named Stern, who took his job perhaps more seriously than it required, had recently flagged an anomaly in the 42nd floor's overnight camera logs, a recurring anomaly, one that involved a maintenance worker he didn't recognize staying in the concert hall well outside his scheduled cleaning window, night after night, alone with the CEO's blind daughter. Stern had pulled the footage that afternoon. He'd watched several minutes of it, then stopped, then called 2 of his colleagues in, and they'd watched it together with the particular focused attention of people assembling a narrative. He'd sent Vivian Ashcroft a summary email at 9:31 p.m. At the exact moment Emma played her new section for the first time, filling the hall with a sound that neither she nor Damon had a word for yet, Vivian Ashcroft was 40 feet above them reading Stern's email on her phone. She read it twice. Then she closed her office door, which she almost never did when she was working alone, and sat very still for a moment in the way of someone deciding how to feel about a thing before she let herself feel it. The email had a subject line: Security alert. Unauthorized access, executive floor, concert hall. Ongoing. It had 3 attached video clips. The shortest one was 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She didn't watch them that night, but she read the summary. And the summary said, Maintenance employee, badge number 4471, Cross D, has been observed on 17 separate occasions accessing the 42nd floor concert hall outside his scheduled maintenance window, in the company of an unescorted minor identified as Emma Ashcroft. Contact is non-physical and appears music-related. Recommend immediate review and appropriate action per standard protocol. Vivian set her phone face down on her desk. She looked at the wall for a minute. Then she picked up her phone again and opened her assistant's number. The message she sent said, Pull the full personnel file for badge 4471 and have it on my desk by 7 a.m. Then she put the phone down, picked up the document she'd been reviewing before Stern's email arrived, and went back to work. She was good at that, compartmentalizing, moving the thing that was pulling at her into a separate room and closing the door on it until she had the bandwidth to deal with it properly. It was one of the skills that had made her very successful and had cost her things she hadn't finished calculating yet. Below her, in the concert hall, Emma finished playing. The last note faded. The hall went quiet except for the rain. "I want to play this for people someday," Emma said. Not wistfully. Just as a statement of intent, the way she said most things. "You will," Damon said. "You don't know that." "True," he said, "but you'll want to, which is the same thing for now." Emma reached out and touched the edge of the music stand, that orienting gesture she used when she was thinking. "My tutors never say things like that." "Like what?" "Like the wanting matters. They always talk about the doing, the practice hours and the technical requirements and the—" She made a small sound that wasn't quite a sigh. "They talk about what I need to be, not what I already am." Damon looked at her. This small, precise, slightly exhausting, genuinely extraordinary kid sitting at a 9-foot piano in an empty hall on the 42nd floor at 11 at night, and thought about what to say. He thought about the right words, the useful ones, the kind that might mean something to her later when this was a memory. He said, "You already are the thing you're trying to become. You just don't trust the evidence yet." Emma was quiet for a moment, then, "That's a strange thing to say." "Yeah. But I think I understand it." "Good," he said. "Now go. Collins is back in 4 minutes." She slid off the bench, picked up the small bag she brought each time with her night vision blockers, and her orientation cane folded inside it, and moved toward the door with the careful confidence of someone who knows the room by heart. At the door she stopped, hand on the frame. "Damon," she said. "Yeah." "You should tell Marcus about the piano." Then she was gone, slipping through the door and into the corridor with the soft efficiency of someone who had been navigating in the dark her whole life and had gotten very good at it. Damon sat at the piano for a moment after she left. The rain was lighter now, the city below shifting into its deepest night configuration, traffic thin, the light changing quality. He put his hands on the keys without pressing them, just feeling the resistance, the specific weight of the action under his fingers. He thought about Marcus. Then he pulled his hands back, stood up, and went to get his cart from the corridor. He had floors to clean. He had a schedule. He had 17 more nights of footage sitting on a security server that he didn't know about yet, being reviewed by people who were in the process of deciding what the story was and what to do about it. People who were looking at something they didn't have the context to understand, and reaching for the explanation that was available to them, and getting it wrong in the particular consequential way that people get things wrong when they see something real and fit it into the wrong frame. But he didn't know any of that yet. He just pushed his cart down the hall, and the building was quiet around him. And somewhere above him, a woman was sitting at her desk in a closed office, holding a piece of information about her daughter that she wasn't sure what to do with, and the gap between what that information meant and what she was about to decide it meant was about to close in a way that nobody was going to enjoy. The personnel file on Damon Cross was thinner than Vivian expected. She'd come in at 6:45 before her assistant arrived, before the coffee service started on the executive floor, before the building populated with the particular morning energy that she'd learned to use as fuel. The file was in a sealed envelope on her desk with a handwritten note from her assistant that said, "Per your request. All available records and nothing else." Vivian had poured herself a cup from the small machine she kept in her private office, sat down, and opened the envelope. 14 months of employment at Aurelius Global. Satisfactory performance reviews from Gerald Huang, the night maintenance supervisor, who described Cross in the clipped, functional language of a man who measured value in completed checklists, punctual, thorough, no incidents. Prior to Aurelius, a 2-year gap in documented employment history, which flag her eyes caught immediately and marked. Before the gap, a military record that the file summarized only as honorable discharge, U.S. Navy, with no further detail because further detail wasn't available to civilian HR departments through standard channels. She sat with the thin stack of papers and thought about the video clips she still hadn't opened. Vivian Ashcroft had built her company from a series of decisions that most people in her position wouldn't have made, and she'd built the habit of knowing exactly what she was looking at before she decided what to do about it. It was one of the few disciplines she considered genuinely useful, and she'd violated it last night by reading Stern's summary without watching the footage, and she'd let herself spend the night making quiet assumptions that she was now, this morning, examining with the colder light of a woman who knew better. She watched the clips. The shortest one was 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She watched it twice. Then she watched the longest one, which was 11 minutes, and ran from a high corner of the concert hall and showed, from that distance and angle, a maintenance worker and a small girl sitting at the Steinway, playing together while rain ran down the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them. The man's posture at the piano wasn't the posture of someone uncomfortable with the instrument. And the girl, Vivian's stomach did something at the sight of Emma at that piano. Emma, with her back straight and her head tilted the way it tilted when she was concentrating, the girl was laughing at something the man had said, a real laugh, the kind that moved her whole body. Vivian couldn't remember the last time she'd heard Emma laugh like that. She tried to place it. She couldn't. She closed the laptop. She sat at her desk for a few minutes, very still, doing the thing she did when she needed to make a decision without the noise of her own reaction getting in the way. Then she picked up her phone and called Stern. He answered on the second ring. "Ms. Ashcroft." "I want him removed today," she said, quietly. "Handle it through HR so there's no scene. I don't want Emma to know until it's done." There was a brief pause on Stern's end. "Understood. Any specific today," she said. "And I want it on record that the concert hall is off limits to maintenance staff except during scheduled cleaning windows." "Yes, ma'am." She hung up. She opened her calendar. She had a 9 o'clock, an 11:30, and a working lunch that was going to run until 3. She pulled up her emails, found the overnight chain from her legal team, and started reading. She didn't let herself think about the laugh. Damon got the call at 2:17 in the afternoon. He was asleep, or trying to be. His sleep schedule after a night shift was always slightly ragged, the body not entirely convinced that afternoon darkness behind blackout curtains was the real thing. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he looked at the number and recognized the Aurelius HR extension and felt something in his chest go careful and still. The conversation was short. A woman named Patricia spoke in the measured, apologetic cadence of someone who had done this enough times to have found the tone that caused the least friction. His services would no longer be required, effective immediately. His final paycheck would be direct deposited within 3 business days. His access badge had been deactivated. His personal belongings from the break room locker, a jacket, a book, a coffee thermos, would be available for pickup at the service entrance during business hours. "Is there a reason?" he asked. A pause. "It's been determined that the arrangement is no longer a fit," Patricia said. He recognized the language. He'd used versions of it himself years ago in debriefs where the honest answer was classified and the available answer was constructed to be technically true without being actually informative. "Okay," he said. "We appreciate your service, Mr. Cross." He said something appropriate and ended the call and lay on his back staring at the ceiling for a moment. He'd been in enough situations where the ground shifted without warning to know that the first few minutes after impact weren't the time for decisions. You cataloged, you assessed, you let the adrenaline settle before you tried to think clearly. What he had, 3 weeks of something that had mattered, ended without ceremony in a 2-minute phone call. What he didn't have, another job lined up, because he'd been punctual and satisfactory and not an incident and had assumed, with the comfortable assumption of someone doing his work well, that he'd continue to have it. What he felt, a specific quiet anger that he recognized from other contexts, the anger of someone who has been categorized before they've been understood, tried in absentia, and found guilty of whatever the categorizer needed them to be guilty of. And below that, underneath the anger, something he didn't let himself look at directly yet. The thought of Emma arriving at the 42nd floor at 9:45 that night, walking the perimeter of the hall, sitting at the piano, waiting for 13 footsteps from the door. He got up. He made coffee. He called the school to arrange aftercare for Marcus for the rest of the week while he sorted out the job situation. Then he sat at his kitchen table with his coffee and thought. At the building, the removal had been handled with the efficiency Stern promised. Gerald Huang had been notified and was quietly irritated. Cross was a good worker, and finding reliable night shift maintenance was not easy. But Gerald knew better than to push back on a directive from the executive floor. 2 of Damon's colleagues found out through the break room grapevine and reacted with the particular resigned unsurprise of people who'd seen this happen before. Priya heard it from Gerald and sat with it for a few minutes, and then texted Damon a message that said, "Heard what happened. That's garbage. Let me know if you need anything." He texted back, "I'm fine. Thank you." She texted back, "You're not fine, but okay." He almost smiled at that. The first indication that something was wrong came 2 days later from an unexpected direction. Marcus came home from school on a Thursday afternoon and dropped his backpack by the door and went to the kitchen for a snack with the uncomplicated efficiency of a child executing a routine. Damon was at the table with his laptop, job listings open in 3 tabs, going through the pragmatics of re-entry. Marcus made himself a bowl of cereal, his preferred after-school snack regardless of time of day, a habit Damon had given up arguing with, and sat across from him. "Dad?" Marcus said. "Yeah." "You seem bad." Damon looked up from the laptop. Marcus was eating his cereal and watching him with the frank, slightly clinical attention that he'd had since he was about 3, the look that meant he had already formed an assessment and was in the process of deciding how to deliver it. "I lost my job," Damon said. He'd been planning to find a better moment for this conversation, but Marcus's face told him the better moment wasn't coming, and the current moment would serve. Marcus absorbed this. He ate another spoonful of cereal. "Because of the girl?" Damon went still. "What girl?" "The blind girl you play piano with." Marcus said it without drama, the way he said most things. "I heard you when you thought I was asleep. Last week you were practicing something in the kitchen at night, really quiet. You thought I was asleep." Damon sat back. "You were supposed to be asleep." "I know." No apology. "Is she okay?" He didn't know. That was the honest answer, and it settled uncomfortably, because not knowing was a state he'd gotten used to managing in military contexts. You accepted incomplete information and worked with what you had. But this was different. This was a small person who had spent 17 evenings trusting him and who was going to show up at a dark piano hall tonight and find him gone, and there was nothing he could do about the specifics of that. "I don't know," he said. Marcus ate the rest of his cereal. He got up, put the bowl in the sink, and came back to the table. He sat down again in the exact same chair, which was a very Marcus thing to do. "You should find out," he said. "It's complicated," Damon said. "Most things are complicated," Marcus said. "You still do them." It was, Damon thought, an extremely inconvenient quality in a child. The ability to say something that simple and have it land that hard. At the Aurelius building, Emma had been told by her evening tutor, a careful young woman named Ms. Park, that the concert hall was undergoing some maintenance work and would be unavailable in the evenings for a while. Ms. Park delivered this information with the slightly overcomposed expression of someone who'd been instructed what to say and was doing their best with it. Emma listened without expression. She was good at listening without expression. "How long is a while?" she asked. "I'm not sure exactly," Ms. Park said. "Is it related to Damon not being here?" Ms. Park's careful expression shifted very slightly. "I don't have information about—" "He's been in the building every night for almost 3 weeks, Emma said. "He's not here and the hall is closed. That's not a coincidence." Ms. Park, who was 24 and genuinely liked Emma and found her frequently exhausting, said, "I'll ask for clarification and let you know." "Please don't," Emma said. "You'll just be told what to tell me and then you'll tell me and it won't be the real answer." Ms. Park had no response to this that was both honest and appropriate, so she said nothing. Emma went to dinner. She sat across from her mother's empty chair. Vivian was in a late meeting. Her assistant had texted she'd be home by 9, and ate what the house staff had prepared, which was good food that she didn't taste. She went through the motions of her evening routine with the mechanical compliance of a child who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to act on it. She went to bed at 9:30. She did not sleep. At 11:15, when the house had settled into its deep night quiet and the security rotation in the mansion's east wing had completed its last pass, Emma got up. She dressed carefully in the dark, which for her was the same as any other time. She packed her small bag with the orientation cane and her transit card and the folded piece of paper on which she'd written in Braille. During dinner, the name and address of Kellner Street, which she'd overheard mentioned once in a conversation between 2 building staff members when they thought she wasn't attending, and the specific detail of the community center on the corner, which she'd found by asking her tablet's accessibility assistant 3 precise questions the previous week. She left through the service corridor on the mansion's north side, which she'd mapped on her second week in the building and had been specifically not using ever since, and which had a door that opened from the inside without triggering the exterior alarm, which she'd discovered by careful listening during a security test she wasn't supposed to know about. It took her 40 minutes on 2 buses and a 6-block walk to reach the address. By the time Vivian Ashcroft's security team realized Emma was gone, it was 12:40 a.m. The first call Stern made was to the police. The second was to Vivian. She answered before the first ring had finished. "Where?" she said. Not a question. "We don't know yet," Stern said. "We're reviewing the cameras now. She left through the North Service exit at approximately 11:22. The silence on Vivian's end had a particular quality to it. Not the absence of sound, but the compression of something enormous into a very small space. Stern had worked for her for 4 years and had seen her in a number of high-pressure situations, and he'd never heard that particular silence before. "Find her," she said. The next 40 minutes were the worst of her life, and Vivian Ashcroft had had some genuinely bad minutes in her 30 years. She stood in the center of her daughter's empty bedroom and looked at the bed that hadn't been slept in, and the braille-marked notebooks on the desk, and the orientation cane that was gone from its hook by the door. Emma had taken it, which meant she'd planned this, deliberately, and with preparation. And Vivian held her phone so tightly that her hand ached. She called her daughter's number, straight to voicemail. Emma's voice on the recording, careful and precise. "This is Emma Ashcroft. Please leave a message with your name and the time you called." Vivian hung up. She called again. Voicemail again. Her security team was in motion, 3 vehicles dispatched, GPS pings attempted on Emma's phone, which had either been turned off or left behind. Vivian didn't know which, and both possibilities were terrible in different ways. The police had 2 units out. Her executive assistant, woken at 1 a.m., was on his phone making calls Vivian had told him to make. His voice from the next room, a low and urgent murmur. Vivian sat on the edge of her daughter's bed. She put her hand on the pillow. It was cold, which meant Emma had been gone for a while before anyone noticed, and the specific detail of that her daughter had been alone in the city for over an hour before anyone knew, did something to Vivian's chest that she would have a hard time describing later to anyone who asked. She was a woman who moved through the world with certainty. She had opinions, and she acted on them, and she was right often enough that the habit had become identity. She had been certain about Stern's security summary. She had been certain about the call to HR. She had been certain that the situation needed to be contained before it became something larger and more complicated, the way she was always certain about things that needed to be managed before they got out of control. She sat on her daughter's cold bed and was not certain about anything. The call came at 1:34 a.m. One of Stern's men, his voice controlled and professionally calm. They'd found her. "Is she—" Vivian started. "She's fine," he said. She's at a community center on Kellner Street, the Cross Center for Kids." A pause that held something the man was trying to decide how to convey. "Ma'am, she's playing piano." The community center was a converted storefront on the corner of Kellner and Marsh, in a neighborhood that wasn't rough exactly, but had the specific texture of a place that had been making do for a long time. The sign above the door was hand-painted. The windows were lit from inside with warm yellow light, and through them, visible from the street, were children. 8 or 10 of them, ranging from what looked like 6 to maybe 13, arranged on folding chairs and a battered couch in the floor. And at the center of the room, at an upright piano that had seen better decades, a small girl in a dark sweater was playing. Vivian's car stopped across the street. She got out before her driver had fully pulled to the curb. She stood on the sidewalk and looked through the window, and her brain did something she was not prepared for, which was to stop generating language entirely. She was a person who thought in words, rapid, efficient, structured words. And for a moment standing on that sidewalk in the cold October air, she had no words at all. Emma was playing, not carefully, not with the hedged precision of a girl performing for a tutor who was grading her. She was playing with her whole body, her shoulders moving with the music, and the piece she was playing was something Vivian didn't recognize, not from the curriculum she'd approved, not from any recital program she'd attended, not from anything she could identify. It was original. The structure of it was unusual, with a roughness in one passage that should have bothered her trained ear and somehow didn't, because what surrounded it was alive in a way that technically perfect playing often wasn't. And beside Emma, sitting on a folding chair rather than the bench was too small for both of them, was the maintenance worker, Cross. He was leaning forward with his forearms on his knees, watching Emma's hands, and the expression on his face was the expression of a person watching something they're not surprised by, but are genuinely moved by anyway. He said something to her that Vivian couldn't hear through the glass. Emma made an adjustment in the higher register, and the phrase she'd been working out clicked into place, and without pausing, she turned her head, rather, in that way she had, toward the man beside her, and he nodded once, and she turned back and kept playing. Around them, the children were listening. One of the younger ones, a boy of about 6 with his chin propped on his fists, was watching Emma with an expression of absolute concentration. An older girl near the back had her eyes closed. Vivian stood on the sidewalk and her throat closed in a way she was not going to examine right now. Later, she would examine it later. But right now her eyes were filling in a way she hadn't anticipated and hadn't prepared for, and she was not a woman who liked to be unprepared. Stern appeared at her elbow. "We can go in, and don't," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. She stood and watched. Emma played the piece through to an ending that arrived without announcement, the melody descending to a resolution that felt earned rather than imposed. The last chord held and released. The children in the room were quiet for a moment, and then the boy with his chin on his fist started clapping, and it spread, and Emma sat with her hands still on the keys and the specific expression of a person who has just given something real of themselves and is feeling the particular vulnerability of that. Damon put his hand briefly on her shoulder, one quick, light touch, and said something. Emma's chin came up. She uncurled from the slight inward curl she'd gone into after finishing, and straightened, and the expression changed from vulnerable to something more like settled. Vivian pushed the door open. The room registered her arrival. The children looked. Stern's 2 men, who had been standing near the window, shifted. Damon Cross looked up from where he was sitting, and his face did something complicated in the space of about a second. Recognition, calculation, a decision made, and then went still. Emma turned her head. "Mom," she said, not scared, not defiant, just Mom. The voice of a person who knew this moment was coming and had decided in advance how to meet it. "Emma," Vivian said. Her own voice was steadier than she felt. "Are you all right?" "I'm completely fine," Emma said. "I've been here for an hour and 20 minutes. The bus took longer than I calculated." Vivian looked at her daughter, sitting at the old upright piano in the lit-up storefront, wearing the dark sweater she'd put on herself in the dark. Her orientation cane folded neatly against the side of the bench, her posture straight with the specific dignity of an 8-year-old who had decided she was going to be the author of her own evening and felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. It had anger in it, and fear that was converting to relief, and something else underneath both of those that was older and harder to look at directly. She looked at Damon Cross. He stood up from his folding chair. He was taller than she'd expected, which was a strange thing to notice, and he held himself in a way that was neither defensive nor aggressive, simply present, squared, and still, with the economy of movement that she associated with people who had spent time in environments where unnecessary motion was a liability. "Mr. Cross," she said. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said. "Mom." Emma's voice was controlled, but there was something firm underneath it. "He didn't bring me here. I came by myself. You can ask Stern. It's on the cameras." "I know," Vivian said. "I know you came by yourself." "Then whatever you're thinking right now, you need to adjust it." The room had gone quiet. The children were watching with the uncomplicated attention of kids who have no investment in performing indifference. The older girl near the back had opened her eyes. Vivian looked at Emma. She looked at the room, the folding chairs, the old piano, the hand-painted sign she'd noticed above the door that said, in plain block letters, Kellner Community Music Project. She looked at the boy with his chin on his fists, who was still watching Emma with that expression of focused wonder. She said to Damon, "This is yours?" "I volunteer here twice a week," he said. "It's not mine. It belongs to the neighborhood." "How long?" 8 months. She absorbed this. "With your own time?" "Yes." She looked at the children again. A girl of maybe 10 in the corner was holding a violin case on her lap with both hands, waiting to see what happened next. A small boy near the window had nodded off against the wall, which was either a commentary on the adult conversation or simply evidence of a child who'd had a long day. "Emma," Vivian said, more quietly, "how did you know to come here?" He mentioned it once, Emma said, that he worked with kids in a community center. He didn't give me the address. I found it myself. A beat. I needed to find him. Vivian turned to look at her daughter fully. Emma was facing her. Not quite facing her, because Emma's facing was always slightly approximate, oriented by sound and air movement rather than visual axis, with an expression that Vivian knew and had not always known how to respond to. It was the expression Emma wore when she had decided something and was waiting for the adult in the room to catch up. Why? Vivian asked. Because they took him away, Emma said, and nobody explained it to me, and nobody asked me what I thought about it, and nobody asked me whether he was someone who mattered, or whether the time we spent together was real, or whether it was important. Her voice was even. She'd clearly been organizing this for 2 days. They just made a decision about my life and expected me to adjust to it. And I'm 8, so I understand why people do that. But I needed him to know that it wasn't nothing. What we did wasn't nothing. The room was very quiet. Vivian stood in the middle of the storefront and looked at her daughter and felt the specific gravity of being seen clearly by a person who loves you and has run out of patience with the version of you that isn't looking back. She had built a company. She had sat across negotiating tables from people twice her age and held her position. She had made decisions with consequences that rippled outward in ways she tracked and managed. She was not a person who was easily disassembled. Emma was 8 years old and had just taken her apart with about 60 words delivered in an even voice from a piano bench in a converted storefront in a neighborhood Vivian hadn't been to before tonight. She turned to Damon Cross. He was still standing in the same position, the same stillness. He was watching Vivian with the expression of someone who is trying to accurately assess a situation without reading into it, which was a discipline she recognized because it was one of her own. I owe you an explanation, she said. You don't, he said. You made a call. I understand why. You understand wrong, she said, which surprised her as it came out, because it was the honest thing rather than the managed thing. I watched the footage, and I made a decision based on what I was afraid of rather than what I actually saw. She stopped. That's not something I do, usually. Damon looked at her for a moment. You were protecting your daughter. I was protecting myself from uncertainty, she said. It came out as protecting my daughter. There's a difference. A silence. One of the children shifted on the couch. The boy near the window slept on undisturbed. Emma said, from the piano bench, Are you two going to keep doing that, or can we go home? I'm actually quite tired. Something happened to Vivian's face that she would have described, if pressed, as the involuntary kind. The kind that happens before the editing mechanism catches it. It was almost a smile, but it ached in a way smiles usually didn't. Yeah, she said, we can go home. She looked at Damon. I'd like to continue this conversation, she said, in a more appropriate setting. Okay, he said. Not tonight, she said. Tonight I need to take my daughter home and… She stopped. Tonight I need to be her mother. That sounds right, he said. Emma slid off the bench and picked up her cane and came toward Vivian's voice with the straight, unhurried confidence of someone who knows where they're going. She stopped beside Vivian and reached out and took her mother's hand, which she rarely did anymore. She'd been working on navigating without physical anchoring, had been practicing independence as a kind of discipline, and Vivian held on to it with a grip that was tighter than she intended. She looked back once, from the doorway, at Damon Cross standing in the warm light of the community center, with the folding chairs and the old piano and the sleeping child against the wall. He gave her a small nod. She returned it. Then she walked her daughter out into the cold street and helped her into the car and sat beside her with their hands still connected. And the car moved through the quiet dark of the city, and neither of them said anything for several blocks. Then Emma said quietly, She needed to hear it. Who? You. You needed to hear what I said. Quiet. You didn't see him, Emma said. Not really. You saw the badge and the cart, and you decided. She turned her head toward her mother with that sideways precision. I can't see anyone, Mom, and I saw him the first night. Vivian looked out the window at the city passing. Her reflection in the glass looked tired and younger than she expected, both at the same time. I know, she said. I know you know, Emma said. That's what I mean. The car was warm. The streets outside were wet and empty. Emma leaned her head against her mother's arm. Another thing she rarely did anymore, the small concessions to closeness she'd been scaling back as she got older and more independent, and closed her eyes. Vivian sat very still and didn't move her arm. Back on Kellner Street, the community center was quieting down. The children were going home, a few picked up by parents who'd gotten Damon's text that the session was running late, one or two heading out on their own into the neighborhood they knew by heart. The boy who'd been sleeping woke up confused and was gently redirected by Damon toward the door and the grandmother waiting in a station wagon at the curb. Damon locked up. He turned off the lights room by room, the familiar routine of closing that he'd done every session for 8 months. He put the folding chairs back against the wall and straightened the music on top of the upright, sheet music that several of the kids had been working from, marked up with their own notations, the page corners soft from handling. He put on his jacket and stood for a moment in the dark of the empty room. He didn't know what was coming. He knew that Vivian Ashcroft was a woman who made decisions quickly and followed them through, and he knew that she'd said she wanted to continue the conversation in an appropriate setting, and he knew that this could mean any number of things in either direction. He knew that Emma was in a car heading home and that she was okay, and the specific relief of that was something he hadn't let himself feel until just now, standing in the dark. He also knew that Emma had said, in front of her mother and Stern and 2 security men and 8 or 9 children, that what they'd done together was not nothing. He stood with that for a moment. It was accurate. He'd known it was accurate for weeks, in the way you know things that you haven't said out loud yet. He went outside, locked the door, and walked to where his car was parked on Marsh Street. It was cold. The city was the particular quiet of very late at night, the traffic reduced to occasional, the sidewalks empty, his breath visible in the orange sodium light. He got in the car. He sat for a moment without starting it. He thought about what Vivian Ashcroft had said. I made a decision based on what I was afraid of rather than what I actually saw. And the specific quality of a person saying something genuinely true about themselves in public. He knew what that cost. He'd paid that cost before, in different contexts, and it had never been cheap. He started the car. He pulled out onto Marsh Street and drove home through the quiet city, and when he got back to the apartment, Marcus was, legitimately this time, asleep. His breathing even through the cracked bedroom door, one foot sticking out from under the comforter in the specific way it always did. Damon stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen table, sat down, and wrote the beginning of a message he'd been forming in his head for the last half hour. I wasn't sure who he was writing it to yet, or whether he'd send it, but the things that needed to be said had a way of finding their form eventually, and sitting with them unsaid had costs of its own that he was done pretending didn't exist. He wrote. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the city turned slowly toward morning. The message Damon had written that night stayed in his drafts folder for 2 days. He went back to it twice, read it, closed it. It wasn't a bad message. It said what he meant without saying too much, which was the balance he'd been trying to hit. But he wasn't sure what sending it would accomplish, and he had a long-standing policy of not doing things he couldn't identify a clear purpose for. The message was addressed to the General Aurelius Global Contact email, which was probably wrong, and he didn't have a direct line for Vivian Ashcroft, which was probably appropriate given that he was an ex-maintenance worker, and she ran a company that occupied a 47-story building. He was in the middle of closing the draft for the 3rd time on a Saturday morning when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered it. Mr. Cross. A woman's voice, not the HR assistant from before, someone different, brisk, competent, precise. This is Dana Reyes, executive assistant to Vivian Ashcroft. Ms. Ashcroft would like to schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience. Would Monday work for you? Damon sat with the phone and looked out the kitchen window. Monday works, he said. 11 a.m. I'll send the address. A brief pause. Not the Aurelius building, a different location. She thought that would be... She said you'd understand why. I do, he said. Thank you, Mr. Cross. He hung up and deleted the draft. Marcus was at the kitchen table eating cereal, his default weekend morning state, and watching him with the particular attention he deployed when he had decided something was interesting. Who was that? Someone I need to meet on Monday, Damon said. The girl's mom? Damon looked at him. You knew about her too? You said her name once, Marcus said. Emma. In your sleep. He said this without any apparent sense that it was remarkable. You talk in your sleep sometimes, mostly about logistics. Damon sat down across from him. This was the kind of conversation where sitting down seemed necessary. I don't know what Monday's going to be, he said honestly. It could be nothing. It could be something. I'm not going to tell you it's definitely fine. Marcus nodded. He ate a spoonful of cereal. Are you nervous? I don't get nervous. Marcus gave him a look that said, with great economy, that this was both factually questionable and not something he was going to argue about right now. He went back to his cereal. The address Dana Reyes sent was a small hotel near the Meridian Park neighborhood, the kind of place that had a lobby cafe available for quiet meetings, no lobby bar, no particular foot traffic. Damon arrived 7 minutes early, which was a habit he couldn't turn off, and ordered a coffee and sat at a corner table with his back to the wall, which was another habit he couldn't turn off. Vivian Ashcroft arrived exactly on time. He'd seen her in photographs, her company's website, a business magazine that had done a profile he'd read exactly once while waiting in a doctor's office with Marcus. But photographs were a specific kind of lie, always. She was smaller in person than corporate photography suggested, or maybe it was that in person she wasn't framed against backdrop and boardroom and the visual language of institutional authority. She was wearing a dark coat over what looked like a plain sweater, her hair pulled back with a practicality that suggested this was a working day and this meeting was part of the work. She looked tired in a way that the photographs never showed, not unwell, just carrying several days' worth of something that didn't have a clean place to set down yet. She spotted him immediately, crossed the lobby without looking at the other tables, and sat down across from him with a directness that he recognized and respected. No preamble about the weather, no social throat clearing. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for the meeting, he said. A server appeared. Vivian ordered coffee, black. They waited until the server was gone. I had your military record pulled, she said. The real one. I have contacts with appropriate clearances. She held his eyes. I want you to know that before anything else, because you deserve to know how I came to understand what I understand. Damon was quiet, waiting. 6 commendations, she said, 19 confirmed rescues in classified theater. 2 deployments that the public record doesn't acknowledge exist. She paused. You left after a mission in which your team's intelligence was compromised. 3 people were injured. 1 was killed. The review board cleared you of any wrong duct. Another pause, more deliberate. But you didn't clear yourself. The lobby was quiet. Soft music from somewhere, low enough to be texture. Damon looked at the coffee cup in front of him. The scar on his right palm was visible against the white ceramic handle. He'd had this conversation once before, with a counselor in the Maryland program, and he'd found a way through it that involved answering accurately without opening anything that couldn't be closed again afterward. The review board was right, he said. I didn't do anything wrong by their metrics. The intelligence failure was upstream of me, but... He stopped, started again. One of the people killed was a civilian we were supposed to extract. She was 28. She had a kid. He kept his eyes on the coffee cup. You can be operationally cleared and still know that you were part of a system that produced a result you can't make acceptable in your own accounting. Those 2 things coexist. Vivian was very still across the table. And Claire, he said, because she had the full file and it would be there. My wife. She died 8 months after I came back. Aneurysm. Nothing to do with any of it, just a thing that happened while I was busy reconfiguring my life around the guilt of the other thing. He looked up. So I had 2 losses in about a year, and a 5-year-old who needed me to be functional, and I made the decisions that seemed right for those conditions. You became a maintenance worker in a corporate building, she said. I became invisible, he said. That seemed right for a while. I could be useful without being seen. I wasn't ready to be seen. The server brought Vivian's coffee. She didn't touch it. She was looking at him with the focused precision of someone who is trying to see the whole of a thing, knows they only have a partial angle and is accounting for that. The music, she said. You studied. Community college, before I enlisted. I thought I might teach or compose or... He half shrugged. I was 20. I thought I was going to do a lot of things. You were good enough that my daughter, who has been studying piano since she was 4 and has worked with instructors I paid significant fees for, made more progress in 3 weeks with you than she'd made in the previous year. Damon didn't have a response to this that wasn't immodest, so he let it stand. She also, Vivian said, and something in her voice shifted slightly. Not cracking, but moving through a register that wasn't the executive register. Laughed. In the video, she laughed the way she laughed when she was 4, before the diagnosis, before everything became... She stopped, picked up her coffee, set it down. Before everything became something that needed to be managed. He understood what she wasn't saying. He'd understood it from Emma's own account. She can fix most things, and she can't fix me. And I don't think I need fixing, but she hasn't figured that out yet. She doesn't need fixing, he said. I know that, Vivian said. I don't think you do. Not all the way. Her eyes came up. The look was sharp, automatic. The response of a person not accustomed to being directly contradicted. Then, a beat later, the sharpness folded into something more complicated and honest. Probably not all the way, she said. No. She's mapped the building to the centimeter, Damon said. She can tell the difference between two people's footsteps after hearing them once. She learned Mandarin at 7. She's composing original music that has things in it that some trained adult composers wouldn't find their way to. He leaned forward slightly. The blindness is real and the challenges are real, and I'm not minimizing them. But you're spending so much energy trying to give her what she can't have that you're not seeing what she's doing with what she's got. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Emma said something similar, she said, about 2 hours after I brought her home. She was very calm about it. That's somehow worse than if she'd been angry. She's not angry at you, Damon said. How do you know? Because she talks about you the way people talk about someone they're not angry at. She says you're busy, and that you love her, and that you haven't figured something out yet. No anger in it, just, he searched for the word, patience. She's being patient with you. Something moved across Vivian's face that she was only partially successful at containing. She looked away briefly, at the lobby's middle distance, and when she looked back, she'd rebuilt whatever she'd let slip, but not completely. I fired you, she said, based on a security summary I read on my phone at 9 at night before I watched a single minute of the footage. You did. I let my head of security characterize a maintenance worker spending unsanctioned time with my blind daughter as a potential manipulation scheme, and I responded to that framing without examining whether it fit anything I actually knew. It was a reasonable response to the information you had, he said. It wasn't, she said flatly. I had access to the footage. I chose not to watch it before acting. That's not reasonable. That's me knowing that the footage might complicate a decision I'd already made. The honesty of this was notable enough that Damon didn't try to soften it for her. She wasn't asking for softening. The executives who went to Stern with this, she said, I want you to know that 2 of them came to me the following week and presented it as a protective measure. They used that word. Protective. Her voice was precise and cold in the way of someone who has spent a week getting angrier at something and has now arrived at the place where anger becomes decision. Harlan Briggs, who heads corporate security strategy, called it a vulnerability management issue. He used the phrase image liability. She looked at Damon. My daughter was not an image liability. She was a child who found the one person in a 47-story building who sat with her like she was worth sitting with. Damon said nothing. They're gone, she said. Briggs and the 2 who escalated to him. I made that decision 4 days ago. She said it without triumph, just as a fact, the way you state facts that were necessary and unpleasant. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this as a gesture toward feeling better about what I did. I'm telling you because you should know the people who characterized you that way are no longer making decisions in that building. Okay, he said. She reached into her coat and placed an envelope on the table between them. Full severance for 14 months plus the 3 weeks of additional value you provided, which I'm calculating separately. She slid it toward him. I know money doesn't... I'm not trying to... She stopped and started again. I'm aware this isn't the part that matters. I'm giving it to you because it's fair, not because I think it resolves anything. He looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up. What's the part that matters? She held his eyes. I'd like to offer you a different position, something I've been thinking about for the past week. She set both hands flat on the table, a gesture he was starting to recognize as her way of grounding herself before saying something she wasn't sure how to say. I want to create a formal program, music and life skills, specifically designed for visually impaired children and children from military families. I want it to have resources behind it, real resources, a proper facility, staff, equipment. I want it attached to the Ashcroft Foundation, which means it outlasts any individual decision I make. She paused. I want you to design it and run it. Damon sat with this. The lobby moved quietly around them. A couple checked in at the front desk. The music continued, low and unidentifiable. I'm a maintenance worker, he said. You're a Navy SEAL with a music education background who has been running a volunteer program for disadvantaged kids for 8 months on his own time with no funding, she said. I'm offering you funding. I don't have a teaching credential. I have lawyers who can help with the certification process, and I have a board that will support an exception framework for qualified practitioners. You are a qualified practitioner. A beat. Also, my daughter learned more from you in 3 weeks than she did in the previous year of credentialed instruction. I'd like to not make the credential the point here. He looked at his coffee cup, the scar across his palm. He thought about the Kellner Community Center, the folding chairs and the old upright, and the boy with his chin on his fists watching Emma play with that expression of pure, undefended attention. The Kellner program, he said. The kids I work with there. Absorbed into the new structure, same participants, better resources. They're my first priority. Before any expansion, before anything else, those kids are already in something that's working, and I won't disrupt it. Agreed, she said without hesitation. Non-negotiable from your end, I accept that. And I make the program decisions, curriculum, staff hiring, participant selection. You fund it and you leave the design to me. I'll want quarterly reports and transparent accounting. That's fair. And I'll want to be involved, not as a director. I don't have the time and it's not my expertise, but as a participant, someone who understands what's being built. She paused. Emma is going to be in this program. I'd like to understand it from the inside. That's a very different thing from running it at arm's length, Damon said. I know, she said. I'm aware that I've been running most of Emma's life at arm's length, and I'd like to correct that. He was quiet for a moment. He had a number of things he could have said, and he chose the one that seemed most useful. She'll push back on you. I expect that. She's not going to soften it to protect your feelings. I know. She's never done that. Something moved in Vivian's expression that was not quite a smile and was not quite grief, and was somewhere in the territory between them. It's one of the things I should have been paying better attention to. The fact that she doesn't soften things, that's not a problem. That's who she is. Damon looked at her for a moment. This woman across the table who had the specific exhaustion of someone who had been getting something wrong, and had just recently, and at some cost, understood how it was wrong. He recognized that kind of tired. He'd seen it in his own mirror enough times. There's something else, she said. She reached back into her coat and pulled out a folded document, printed, not a screen, which was a deliberate choice he registered, and placed it on the table beside the envelope. I'd like to make a public statement to the company and, if you're willing, through a press release that our communications team has drafted. I want to acknowledge what happened, not in corporate language. Not in a way that manages the story. Actually acknowledge it. She met his eyes. I embarrassed you in front of your colleagues, and I ended your employment based on a misreading that I made because I wasn't paying attention to my own child. People in that building should know that the mistake was mine. Damon looked at the folded document. He didn't touch it either. You don't have to do that, he said. No, she agreed. I don't have to. I want to. A pause. I spend a lot of time in that building telling people that accountability matters. It would be useful to demonstrate that I mean it when it costs me something. He thought about Gerald Huang, who'd been quietly irritated and hadn't pushed back. He thought about Priya, who'd texted, "That's garbage," and meant it. He thought about his access badge, deactivated, color-coded gray, already returned to the stock of spares in the building's security office. He thought about walking out of a government building in Virginia 3 years ago and driving 4 hours to a kitchen table where a 5-year-old boy was eating cereal, and the decision he'd made in that car, and all the decisions since then, and the long, strange path between that kitchen table and this lobby table, and the woman sitting across from him who was telling him that the mistake had been hers, and she intended to say so. Okay, he said. She blinked, just slightly. Okay to which part? All of it, he said. The program, the statement, the quarterly reports. He picked up the envelope. He put it in his jacket pocket. Emma needs to be involved in the program design, not as a participant, as a co-designer. She has opinions about what blind kids actually need that are better informed than mine or yours. Vivian's expression shifted. A full, real shift. Not managed, not constructed. She'll have opinions about everything else, too. I know, he said. That's the point. She put her hand out across the table. He shook it. Her grip was firm and direct and didn't perform anything. He appreciated that. I'll have Dana send you the formal proposal, she said. Take whatever time you need to review it. If there are terms that don't work, come back to me directly. She stood, pulling her coat around her. Then she stopped. For what it's worth, the footage, the 17 clips. She looked at him with the particular steadiness of someone deciding to say the true version of a thing rather than the easier version. I've watched all of them now, multiple times. Not for security review. A pause. Thank you. For being someone who stayed. She left before he could respond, which he thought was probably deliberate. He sat at the corner table for a while after she was gone, his back to the wall out of habit, his coffee gone cold. He took the envelope out of his pocket and held it without opening it. He thought about what came next in the specific way he thought about operations. Not the feeling of it, but the logistics, the sequencing, what had to happen in what order for the thing to become real. He needed to tell Marcus, not the version that protected Marcus from uncertainty, but the actual version, what this was and what it might become, and the specific honest fact that Damon didn't know yet whether he was the right person for a job this size. That conversation was going to require sitting down and probably cereal on Marcus's part, and it was going to require Damon to say things he'd been keeping in the vague middle territory between plans and possibilities, which was where he kept things he was afraid of wanting. He also needed to call Priya. She was looking for better work. She'd mentioned it twice in the break room, her daughter's school fees going up. And she was organized and reliable and had the particular quality of person who could run a room without making the room feel like it was being run. He wasn't going to promise her anything before the proposal was signed. But he was going to call her, and he needed to go to Kellner Street, to the community center, and tell the kids there what was happening. That part he was most careful about. He'd known people who ran programs like this, community programs, underfunded and overstretched, who'd gotten absorbed into institutional frameworks and come out the other side unrecognizable. The Kellner kids were his first priority. He'd said that across the table, and he'd meant it, and he needed to walk back into that room and look at the boy who sat with his chin on his fists, and the girl who played violin, and the ones who hadn't started yet, and were only there because the lights were on and the door was open. He needed to look at them and be sure, genuinely sure, that what he was about to build was for them and not for the version of himself that wanted to be the kind of person who built things. He thought it was. He was about as certain as he ever was about anything, which was not completely certain, which was about right. His phone buzzed. Marcus, text message. How did it go? He looked at it. He typed back. Come home at 4. We need to talk. 3 dots appeared. Then, that sounds bad. He typed, it's not bad. The dots again. Then, how not bad? He looked at the lobby ceiling for a second. Then he typed, possibly good. Possibly a lot of work. Same thing sometimes. A pause. Then a thumbs up emoji, which from Marcus was a form of eloquence. He put his phone in his pocket and sat for another minute in the quiet hotel lobby. He thought about the Steinway on the 42nd floor and the first night, Emma's left hand finding the interval, the rain on the windows, the particular quality of 2 people making music in a room where neither of them had intended to be. He thought about the 17 nights after that, the accumulated texture of them, the way Emma had moved from defensive precision to genuine interpretive risk, the way the piece she was composing had grown from something tentative into something that filled the hall's acoustics with a specific, earned authority. He thought about Claire, which he tried to do gently when it came on him like this. Not the moment of it, which was the part that still arrived sometimes at 3 in the morning with all its jagged edges, but the actual person, the specific woman who had told him once, early in their relationship, that he was the kind of person who needed a clear mission or he'd spend his energy looking for one in places that couldn't bear the weight. She'd been accurate about most things. She'd been accurate about that. He stood up. He left cash on the table for the coffees. He put on his jacket. Outside, the October air was sharp and clear, the city moving around him with its usual indifference. He walked to where his car was parked, 3 blocks away, and the walk felt different from how walks had felt for a while. Not lighter exactly, that was too simple, but different in the way that things feel when you've moved from standing still into motion, and your body is remembering that it knows how to do this. That afternoon, at 4 o'clock, he sat Marcus down at the kitchen table with cereal on Marcus's part and coffee on his, and he told him the actual version, all of it. Emma, the piano hall, the 17 nights, the firing, Kellner Street, the meeting that morning, the proposal that was coming. He told it in order, without managing it, and Marcus listened with the particular focused attention he always brought to things that mattered. When Damon finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. He ate the last of his cereal. He set the bowl to the side with the same care he always gave to that gesture. "The blind girl," he said. "Emma." "Yes." "She's the one who came to find you at Kellner." "Yes." "By herself." "At night." "Yes." Marcus absorbed this. "She's 8, he said. "Same age as you," Damon said. Marcus looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, complicated in the way that children get complicated when they're processing something real and don't have a shortcut for it. "She must have been really scared," he said. "I don't think she was," Damon said. "I think she was very sure about what she needed to do, and she went and did it." "Huh." Marcus turned this over. "Is she nice?" "She's honest," Damon said. "Which is better." Marcus nodded, apparently finding this satisfactory. "Are you going to take the job?" "I'm thinking about it." "Dad." "I'm seriously thinking about it." "Dad," Marcus said again, in the voice he used when he thought Damon was performing uncertainty he didn't actually feel. He'd developed this voice somewhere around age 6, and it had gotten more accurate every year. Damon drank his coffee. He looked at his son across the kitchen table. This small, serious, inconveniently perceptive kid who had been carrying half the weight of their particular life, with a steadiness that Damon had tried not to take for granted, and probably had sometimes taken for granted. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to take it." Marcus nodded once, in exactly the way he nodded when something confirmed what he already knew. He pulled his bowl back toward him and picked up his spoon. "Good," he said. "You needed a mission." Damon looked at him. The specific ache of that, the accuracy of it, coming from this particular source. He put his coffee cup down. He looked at the table for a second. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Marcus was already on the last spoonful, the documentary watcher and cereal eater and quiet observer who had been holding his own corner of things with more grace than most adults managed. He finished, put the spoon down, and pushed back from the table. "Can I meet her?" he asked. "Probably," Damon said. "Eventually." "Do you think she'll like me?" Damon thought about Emma. Her directness, her precision, the way she'd told him on the second night that she was not supposed to be in the hall past 9 and done it without any apparent irony. "She'll tell you exactly what she thinks of you," he said, "within about 10 minutes. Marcus considered this. "That's fine," he said. "I do that too." He picked up his bowl and took it to the sink and went back to his room, leaving Damon at the table with his coffee and the specific quiet of an apartment where something had just shifted into a new configuration. And the new configuration was not perfect and not finished and had a considerable amount of uncertainty still coiled inside it, and was also undeniably something. The proposal from Dana Reyes arrived this following Thursday. Damon read it twice. He made 11 notes in the margins. He emailed them to Dana, who turned them around to Vivian, who accepted 8 of the 11, negotiated 2, and on the 11th, which was Damon's insistence that the program be named for its participants and not for the Ashcroft family, agreed with a response that was 2 sentences. "You're right. Name it what it should be named." He signed on a Friday in a small conference room 2 blocks from the Aurelius building, with Vivian's lawyer across the table and the proposal in front of him. He used the pen from his shirt pocket, the one he kept with his schedule. The same shirt pocket that used to hold the laminated cleaning schedule Gerald Huang had handed him 14 months ago. He signed his name. Outside the window, the city moved with its ordinary, enormous life, and 3 blocks away the Aurelius building rose 47 floors, and the concert hall on 42 sat quiet in the afternoon, waiting, the Steinways lid down now, the room empty, the light coming in from the west windows at a low October angle. 2 days later, Vivian stood in front of the full Aurelius staff in the ground floor atrium. 200 people. the ones who worked the floors and the ones who ran the floors, in the same room for the first time since the company's anniversary 2 years ago, and read a statement that her communications team had drafted and she had rewritten 3 times until it said the thing she actually meant, rather than the thing that was professionally advisable. She said that she had made a decision based on fear and insufficient information, and that the decision had been wrong, and that the person most affected by it deserved better from the leadership of this company. She said she was announcing a new program under the Ashcroft Foundation, and that its director was Damon Cross, and she said his name clearly, in a room full of people who had seen him pushing a cart through corridors for 14 months, and had not, most of them, learned it. She said that the measure of an institution was not how it performed when everything was going right, but how it behaved when something it didn't understand came through its door, and that on that measure they had not done well, and she intended to do better. She did not read from notes for the last part. She folded the paper and looked at the room. The people this company should aspire to be, she said, are the people already in it who are doing something useful when nobody's watching. I think most of you know what I mean. Damon was not in the atrium. He was at Kellner Street, at the community center, in the middle of a session with 8 kids and an upright piano and a violin and a clarinet that was missing one key, and a boy who had just played a G major scale correctly for the first time, and was looking at his own hands like they'd done something he hadn't authorized. He'd heard enough speeches. He had work to do. The concert hall they built was nothing like the one on the 42nd floor. That had been the point. When Damon sat down with the architect the foundation hired, a quiet woman named Soo-Jin Park, who had spent 15 years designing spaces for children with sensory differences, and who asked better questions than most people Damon had worked with in any context. He'd been clear about what he didn't want. He didn't want marble and cathedral ceilings and the particular acoustics of rooms designed to impress. He wanted a room that sounded honest, a room where a child could make a mistake and hear it clearly and not feel like the room was judging the mistake. Soo-Jin had understood immediately. She'd drawn something on a napkin in their first meeting, rough, gestural, just the basic shape of the idea. And Damon had looked at it and said, "That's it." The Kellner Cross Music Center, the name had been Emma's suggestion, offered at a planning meeting with the particular composure of someone who has thought a thing through and decided to say it, opened 13 months after Damon signed the proposal. It sat 3 blocks from the original community center on Kellner Street, in a building that had been a printing warehouse and still had the bones of that visible. High industrial ceilings, modified for acoustics, original brick walls, wide windows along the north face that brought in light without glare. The main performance hall seated 200 on raked wooden floors with movable seating. There were 6 practice studios with instruments adapted for various physical needs, a recording space, and a common room with a kitchen that operated on the principle that children practiced better when they weren't hungry, which was the kind of thing that seemed obvious once you said it, and that most institutions never got around to actually doing. The staff Damon had built over those 13 months was 8 people. He'd hired Priya Chen as operations director, which she'd accepted with a brevity that suggested she'd been expecting the call and had already thought through her answer. She ran the administrative side with the same efficient attention she'd brought to floors 30 through 35, and had, within 3 months, developed systems for participant intake and instrument maintenance and studio scheduling that were so clean. Damon mostly just stayed out of her way and was grateful. He'd hired 3 music instructors, one who specialized in adaptive techniques for blind and low-vision students, one who had spent a decade working with children from military families and understood the specific, often unspoken things those children carried, and one who was 26 and had grown up in the Kellner neighborhood and whose primary credential was that every kid she'd ever taught had come back for more. He'd had a conversation with a credentialing board that had been difficult and long and had required Vivian's lawyers to do several things he hadn't entirely followed. And at the end of it, he had a title that the board was willing to put on paper. He didn't care much about the title. He cared about the room. The original Kellner kids were all still there. The boy who'd played his first G major scale correctly on the day Vivian gave her speech at Aurelius. His name was Devin. He was 7, and he had been raised by his grandmother since age 3, was now 9, and working through a simplified jazz curriculum with a focus and appetite that made the 26-year-old instructor, whose name was Raina, openly delighted on a regular basis. The girl with the violin case, who was named Sophia, and had initially come to the center because her older brother brought her, and had stayed because she was, it turned out, genuinely extraordinary, had been offered a place in a youth orchestra program across town, and Damon had spent 2 evenings helping her and her mother understand the paperwork. These were not dramatic outcomes. Nobody was going to write a headline about Devon learning jazz or Sophia's orchestra audition. But this was the thing Damon had understood from the beginning and had tried to build into the center structure from the ground up. The point was never the dramatic outcome. The point was the room being available, the instrument being there, the door being open on a Wednesday afternoon when a kid had nowhere better to be, and something they didn't have words for yet that music might eventually help them find words for. You didn't measure that. You just kept the lights on and trusted that it was happening. Vivian had kept her word about being involved rather than managing. It had not been easy for her. Damon had watched her learn, over the course of the year, how to be in a room. She wasn't running, which was a skill that didn't come naturally to her and that she'd pursued with the same focused discipline she brought to everything. She came to the center twice a week, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she sat in on sessions and she made herself useful in the specific, unobtrusive ways available to someone who is deliberately not being in charge. She fixed things. She learned everyone's names, including the siblings who came to wait, and the parents who arrived early, and the grandmother who brought Devon and always sat in the corner of the common room with a cup of tea and a library book, available but not hovering. Emma had been right that Vivian hadn't figured something out yet, but Emma had also been right that it was a solvable problem, and the solving of it was one of the quieter, less narratable things that had happened in that year because it didn't happen in a single moment or a speech or a dramatic realization. It happened in increments, the way most real changes do. Vivian arriving on a Tuesday and sitting next to her daughter at a practice room piano instead of watching from the doorway. Vivian learning the names of Devon's favorite jazz musicians because Devon had mentioned them and she'd gone home and looked them up. Vivian sitting through an entire 2-hour session one Saturday without checking her phone, which she mentioned to Damon afterward with the slight disbelief of someone noting a personal record. "Is that the first time?" he asked. "Don't push it," she said, which was as close to self-deprecating humor as he'd seen from her, and which he recognized as a form of progress. Emma, for her part, had become the center's most reliable unofficial ambassador, a role she had not been assigned, and that she occupied with the specific authority of someone who has earned standing through presence rather than title. She knew every student by voice. She had opinions about room acoustics and studio placement and the specific brand of piano bench that was more comfortable for smaller students. And she delivered these opinions to whoever was responsible for such decisions with a directness that had initially startled Priya and now simply made Priya take notes. She was 9 now. In the past year, she had finished the original composition she'd been working on since before Damon first walked through the concert hall door. The piece that had started as a 5-note motif she couldn't get the left hand to hold, and had grown over 17 secret sessions and then months of more formal work into something that was 43 bars long, fully scored, and held in it both the hesitancy of its beginning and the confidence of everything that had been learned since. She hadn't told anyone it was done. She'd told Damon in the practice room on a Thursday afternoon, playing the last bars for him for the first time. And when she finished, she'd sat very still with her hands on the keys and said nothing. He'd said nothing either, for a while. "It's finished," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It took a long time." "Good things usually do." She played the last 8 bars again, slowly, the resolution he'd first played for her in the dark concert hall on the 42nd floor. The descending answer to the climbing question, the call and response, now transformed by everything that had come after it, fuller and more complicated and more itself than either of them could have predicted from that first evening. "I want to play it at the opening concert," she said. "I know," he said. "I was waiting for you to say so." She turned toward him with that slight sideways tilt. "You knew it was done?" "I could hear it was getting close," he said. "The last few weeks, the way you'd stop after certain passages. You were checking whether they needed anything else." "They didn't," she said. "No," he said. "They didn't." The opening concert was a Saturday in November, a year and 1 month after the foundation proposal had been signed. The Kellner Cross Music Center's main hall seated 200 and was full, which Priya had managed with characteristic efficiency, and which had required a waiting list for the last 40 seats. The audience was a specific mix: foundation board members, parents of students, People from the neighborhood who'd watched the building go up. A journalist from the city paper who'd been quietly covering the center's development for 3 months and whose editor had suggested the story was bigger than she'd initially thought. Marcus was in the third row with Damon's mother-in-law, Claire's mother, Eleanor, who had driven 6 hours from Pennsylvania because Marcus had called her himself and told her she needed to come. Eleanor was 71 and had been dealing with her own version of the past 2 years and had said yes without hesitation and had brought flowers that were now sitting on the table in the common room because there'd been no good place to put them in the hall. Damon stood in the wing of the small stage, which was not really a wing so much as a gap between the acoustic panels and the side wall, and watched the hall fill. He was wearing a dark blazer over a plain shirt, which was as dressed as he intended to get, and he'd had a brief conversation with himself that morning about whether the occasion called for something more formal and had decided it didn't, because the occasion was about the kids, and the formality should serve that rather than the other way around. He thought about the first night, Emma's left hand on the keys and the rain against the glass, and the decision he'd made to sit down at the bench that he hadn't been able to justify with any clear rationale, and that had turned out to be one of the few genuinely right decisions he'd made in the years since everything fell apart. He thought about this without drama. It was just the truth of it, sitting there. He thought about Claire, who would have found Emma extraordinary and would have told Damon so with a directness Emma herself would have recognized. He missed her in the specific weathered way he'd learned to miss her, the way that didn't undo him anymore, but that never fully went away either, which he'd come to understand was not a failure of healing, but just the correct shape of a loss that was real. He wasn't fixed. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, standing in the wing before the concert, because the narrative version of the past year had a shape that suggested fixing, the broken man given purpose, the wound closed by meaning. That wasn't what had happened. What had happened was that he'd found work that was genuinely his, and people who were genuinely worth the effort. And these things hadn't repaired anything so much as they'd given the unrepaired part somewhere to be that wasn't just taking up space. The 3 a.m. waking still came. The weight of the mission in Virginia was still there. He still drove past certain things sometimes and felt the specific pull of the past like a hand on his shoulder. But he had this room. He had Marcus, who was 9 now, and had met Emma 3 weeks after the Kellner night and had assessed her in approximately 8 minutes and reported to Damon afterward that she was very direct but okay, which in Marcus's vocabulary was a significant endorsement. He had the center and the kids and Priya running operations, and Raina teaching Devon jazz, and the practice studios with the adapted instruments, and the common room kitchen that operated on the principle that children practiced better when they weren't hungry. He had enough. He'd learned, at some cost, that enough was not nothing. Vivian appeared beside him in the wing. She was doing the same thing he was, watching the hall fill, her hands in her coat pockets, her face quiet with the particular expression of someone who is trying to simply be in a moment rather than assess it. "Full house," she said. "Priya's work," he said. "Yours too." He didn't argue with this. "How's Emma?" "She told me to stop asking how she is because she's not nervous." Vivian's mouth curved very slightly. "Then she asked me to feel whether her collar was straight." "Was it?" "It was perfect," she said, "but she needed to check." She was quiet for a moment. The hall was almost full, the sound of it shifting from ambient to something with more mass, more warmth. Devon was somewhere in the front rows with his grandmother, who had put on what was clearly her good coat for the occasion. Sophia was in the orchestra section near the back, violin case on her lap as usual. "I want to say something," Vivian said, "before it starts." "Okay." "I'm not good at this." She said it plainly, without apology. Saying things that aren't in service of a point, just saying them because they're true. "I know," he said. "The past year," she started. She stopped. Tried again. "I've been watching you work. In this building. With these kids, with Emma, and I keep thinking about what I very nearly prevented from happening." She didn't look at him, she looked at the hall. "Not just your job, not just the piano sessions. The thing you gave Emma, which she's been carrying since the first night, and which I didn't have the sense to recognize because I was too busy trying to give her things I could buy." A breath. "She told me something last week. She said that you taught her that the hard part of the music, the part that feels wrong, is usually the part that's trying to say something true. And she said she thinks that's probably true about people too. Damon was quiet. That's not something I taught her, Vivian said. I didn't have it to teach. I was still figuring out what to do with my own hard parts. She looked at him then, directly, the full weight of her attention in the way she had when she was not managing the conversation but simply inside it. So, thank you for sitting down at that bench, for all of it. She would have found someone, Damon said. She had it in her already. She would have found a way to it. Maybe, Vivian said, but she found you. He didn't have an answer to that, and she didn't seem to need one. She moved away, back toward the hall, and Damon stayed in the wing and let the moment settle the way you let a chord settle, holding it until it was done, saying what it needed to say. The program started at 7. There were 4 performances before Emma's, Devin playing a blues progression that made his grandmother put her hand over her mouth, a group piece from 6 of the center's students aged 7 to 12 that was rough in places and held together by sheer collective will, which was more interesting than polish would have been. A solo from a 15-year-old girl named Amara, who had started at the center 4 months ago and played the cello with the focused intensity of someone who had found the thing their hands were made for. And a short piece from 2 students who played together, violin and piano, stumbling at the same moment and recovering together and finishing with the specific unself-conscious joy of kids who have just pulled something off. Then Emma. She walked to the stage without assistance. She had declined the option firmly when it was offered, which surprised nobody who knew her. She walked the way she walked in the practice rooms, with the careful, inhabited confidence of someone who has learned to move through space as a skill rather than a concession. She found the bench by touch, settled, adjusted. The hall was quiet. She didn't introduce the piece. She'd been asked whether she wanted to say something first, and she'd said, "The music says what it says. If I explain it first, I'm not trusting it." And that had been the end of that conversation. She played. The opening, the 5-note motif, the climbing question she'd first played in the empty concert hall a little over a year ago, working it out alone in the dark while rain ran down 42 floors of glass, came out of the silence with a simplicity that was almost startling. Not because it was soft, though it was, but because it was undefended. It made no claim to being more than it was. It just went up, the way a question goes up, the way the voice goes up at the end when something genuinely isn't settled. And then the left hand found it. The interval she'd collapsed 100 times before Damon showed her how to curve the finger, how to hold the connection through the transfer. It was there now, solid and sure, holding the ground while the right hand climbed. The 2 parts working together the way they were meant to, not performing unity, but actually in it, the music breathing as one thing. Damon stood in the wing and watched. He watched Emma find the rough passage, the chord she'd been uncertain about a year ago, the one he'd told her not to overpolish, the one that pulled and unresolved in the middle of the piece like a question that wasn't done being asked, and play it with complete conviction. Not performing uncertainty, actually sitting with it, letting the tension exist, letting it mean something rather than resolving it too early into something easier. And then he watched her take it where it needed to go. The piece moved through its middle section with the kind of authority that comes not from technical perfection, but from a performer who understands what they're saying and trusts the saying of it. Emma's shoulders moved with the music. Her face was the face she wore when she was most herself. Not the composed, careful face she used in formal situations, but the face that was present without armor, inside the thing she was doing rather than managing how it looked from the outside. In the 3rd row, Marcus had stopped watching the stage and was watching his father in the wing, which Damon didn't notice until later when Marcus told him. What Marcus saw was his father's face doing something Marcus had been waiting 2 years to see it do. Not happy exactly, or at least not only happy, but open in the specific way that had been closed for a long time, present in the way of someone who has found their way back to a room they thought they'd lost the key to. Marcus was 9. He didn't have words for this yet, but he held it. Eleanor beside him took his hand. He let her. The piece arrived at its resolution, the descending answer, the call and response, the ending that Damon had first played for Emma in the dark. And it was not the same ending anymore. A year of living had been added to it. The question it answered was older and more complicated than the one Emma had been asking when she was stuck in the empty hall, and the answer was correspondingly more complex, not simpler, not tidier, but more true. She held the last chord. Let it fill the room. Let it be done. The hall was still for a moment. Then Devon, 8 years old, in the front row, started clapping with the unselfconscious enthusiasm of a child who is moved and has no reason to perform otherwise, and the hall followed, and the sound rose into the space that Sujin Park had designed to be honest. And it was. Emma sat at the bench with her hands still on the keys for a few seconds after the chord faded, just being with it. Then she stood and turned toward the sound of the audience, and the particular expression on her face was one that Damon had never seen on her before. Not composed, not calibrated, not the careful propriety of a child who has learned to navigate a world that doesn't account for her. It was simply satisfied. The satisfaction of someone who has done the work and said the true thing and has not held back from saying it. She reached the wing. Damon was there. She found his arm by feel, the habitual orientation, and then she did something she hadn't done before in any of their sessions or their evenings in the hall or their months working in the center together. She leaned her head briefly against his arm, just for a second. Then she straightened. "How was it?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was waiting. "It said what it was supposed to say," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I was scared," she said. "Before I went out, I didn't tell my mom." "I know," he said. "How did you know?" "Because it mattered enough to be scared about," he said. "And you went anyway." She thought about this. Is that what courage is? He'd been asked this before, in different contexts, by people who wanted a clean answer. He'd learned not to give clean answers to questions that didn't have them. "It's one version," he said. "There are others. You'll find them." She nodded, apparently finding this sufficient. Then she said, "Your son is looking at you." Damon turned. Marcus was standing at the entrance to the wing, still holding the program from the concert, Eleanor a few steps behind him with her hand-over-mouth expression still not fully resolved. Marcus looked at his father with the frank, direct attention he'd been deploying since age 3, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Marcus said, "She was really good." "She was," Damon agreed. Marcus looked at Emma. "I'm Marcus," he said. "I know," Emma said. "Your stride is slightly longer than your father's, and you tap your right foot when you're listening. You tap the whole time." Marcus processed this. "Is that weird?" "No," Emma said. "It means you are actually listening." She tilted her head toward him. "You're 9, right?" "Yeah." "I'll be 9 in 6 weeks." "Cool," Marcus said with the easy equivalence of a child for whom age is a simple data point. "Do you want to see the practice rooms? My dad showed me all of them." Emma turned toward Damon's voice to check whether this was appropriate. He gave her nothing because it was not a question that needed him. She turned back toward Marcus. "Okay," she said. Marcus led her away from the wing, talking already, his voice going into the particular register he used when he was explaining something he found interesting. Emma walked beside him, slightly sideways, tracking him with the attention she brought to people she'd decided were worth paying attention to. Damon watched them go. Eleanor appeared beside him. She was small and white-haired and had the specific quality of a woman who had outlived several kinds of grief and was still standing, which had always made Damon trust her judgment about things. She put her hand on his arm, briefly. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "How was the drive?" he asked. "Long," she said. "Worth it." She watched Marcus and Emma disappear around the acoustic panel. "He called me himself, told me I had to see this. He said, 'It's important, Grandma Eleanor. He needs people there.'" Damon looked at the floor. "He's a good kid," she said. "I know," he said. "Claire would have—" She stopped herself, started again differently. "She would have been sitting in the front row since 2 o'clock to get the best seat." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." The hall was emptying slowly, the way halls empty after something real. People not rushing, lingering at the edges of what they'd just experienced, not quite ready to go back to the outside. Damon could see Vivian across the room, talking to Devon's grandmother, leaning down to listen to Devon himself, who was apparently delivering an opinion about something with considerable conviction. Vivian was nodding with the genuine attention she'd learned to deploy, not the performed listening of someone waiting for their turn, but actual attention, the kind that costs something. Priya was near the door, managing the flow of people with 2 clipboards and the calm efficiency of someone who has seen worse. Raina was with Amara the cellist and Amara's parents, and from the body language across the room, it looked like a conversation about next steps, which was Raina's favorite kind of conversation. Sophia was standing near the back with her violin case, watching all of it with the violin player's particular quality of observing before committing. She caught Damon's eye across the room and gave him a small nod, the nod of someone who understood what had been built here and was taking note of it. He nodded back. The truth that Damon had arrived at, slowly and without announcing it, over the 13 months of building the center and the year of running it, was not the kind of truth that resolves everything. It was more modest than that and more durable. The truth was this, that the things which matter most are almost never the things that look like they matter most from the outside. The commission and the commendation and the operation that gets written up. The corner office and the quarterly number and the correct performance in the right room. These things have their worth. But the worth that carries, the worth that moves through time without diminishing, lives in the smaller transactions. The 17 evenings on the 42nd floor. The folding chairs in the Kellner's storefront. The moment a child's left hand finds an interval it has been losing for weeks and holds it and realizes it can hold it. He was not a hero. He wanted to be honest about this because the story, the way others were beginning to tell it, had a hero's shape to it, and he knew what that shape left out. It left out the years he'd spent making himself invisible because invisibility was easier than being known. It left out the bad nights and the way he'd told himself in the first week of those piano sessions that he wouldn't go back when what he meant was that he was afraid of what it would cost him to stay. It left out the specific, ordinary selfishness of a man who'd been protecting himself from caring about things because the last time he'd cared fully about things, it had nearly finished him. Emma had not saved him. Marcus had not saved him. Vivian's foundation had not saved him. These were true things, and he was glad of them, and they had not saved him because he was not a man who needed saving so much as a man who needed to stop pretending the wound was someone else's wound and get on with the work of having it. The work was the thing. The room, the instrument, the door open on a Wednesday afternoon, Devon's first correct G major scale, Sophia's orchestra audition, Emma's piece finished and played and given to the audience without holding anything back. He had signed on to do this work. And he was doing it, and it was enough. From across the hall, Emma's voice. She and Marcus had come back from the practice rooms, Emma talking with the focused animation she had when she was explaining something technical to someone she'd decided could keep up. Marcus was keeping up. His foot was tapping. Damon watched his son and the girl who had found him on Kellner Street and decided the situation required action. These two 9-year-olds moving through the hall with the easy authority of children who have been told that they belong in a room and have chosen to believe it. He thought, this is what it looks like when it works. Not perfect, not without cost, but working, actually working, in the specific and irreducible way that means real things are happening to real people, and the meaning is not being manufactured but found. Later that night, after the hall was cleared and the chairs were stacked, and Priya had given him the final attendance count with the satisfaction of a person who had predicted it correctly, he sat in the empty performance space by himself for a while. The lights were down except for the work lights in the corners. The instruments were back in the studios. The room was quiet in the way of rooms that have recently held something and are still holding the shape of it. He sat where Emma had sat. He put his hands on his knees. He thought about the 42nd floor, the rain on the glass, the first 13 footsteps from the door. I thought about what Emma had said to him after the concert, quietly, just before Marcus led her away to the practice rooms. She had said, "You didn't teach me how to play the piano." He'd waited. "You taught me how to be in the room," she said. "Even when the room is dark, even when you're the only one in it. You taught me how to be in it anyway, and trust that the music knows where it's going." He had not said anything. She hadn't needed him to. He sat in the quiet hall now and let that sit with him. Outside, the city moved. Marcus was home with Eleanor, who was staying the weekend, and he'd texted to say they'd ordered pizza, and Marcus had already explained to Eleanor in full detail how the center's acoustic panels worked, which Eleanor had apparently received with great patience. Damon sat for a while longer, not meditating or resolving anything, just being in the room, trusting that the work knew where it was going, letting the quiet be quiet. Then he got up, turned off the work lights, and went home.